Here at the Vancouver Public Library since February 12th, when an opinion article about this evening's event appeared in the Vancouver Sun, we have experienced just how difficult this can be. As we know, there are community members, and particularly those from the Jewish community, who are angry, hurt, and offended that this event is taking place, and they have called for its cancellation. We very much regret that this is the case. However, it remains the library's belief that we must stand by the principle of freedom of expression, and therefore the decision was made not to cancel the program. The selection of materials collected and presented at Vancouver Public Library is based on the belief that every person has the right to access all expressions of knowledge, opinion, and creativity, and express their thoughts publicly within the limits set by law. This freedom of access is essential to the health and development of a democratic society. However, freedom of choice within the library cannot be limited by the personal views of any group or individual, even the majority. Upholding the principle of intellectual freedom can also at times put you in the position of appearing to support points of view in which you do not believe. The role of the public library, however, is to provide a forum for an open and public exchange of contradictory views and to make available materials that represent a wide range of views. This is especially true during Freedom to Read Week, when libraries often present books that people might feel uncomfortable reading. Greg Felton's new book, The Host and the Parasite, is such a book. Greg Felton currently writes for print and online publications about Middle Eastern and Canadian politics. He has a bachelor's degree in Russian studies and a master's degree in political science from the University of British Columbia. With that, I will now introduce Greg Felton.
What I'd like to start off by suggesting is that those of you who have looked at the United States over the last 8 years can only look with sadness and despair at what has happened to what used to be a republic. For 225 years, the United States has been at least nominally supportive of things like individual rights, protection of the person, the rights against the accused, habeas corpus, the right against illegal search and seizure. And now, as we look around, we have the United States becoming the apotheosis, the very opposite of what it started out to be. Torture is now officially justified as national policy. The United States has declared war on its own citizens. People can be arrested without warrant. Wiretaps are allowed without judicial permission. The economy has been spent into an absurd debt of $9 trillion, much of it earned during the time of George W. Bush. And over this time, we are supposed to think of the United States as a republic, as the same country that you and I grew up with. When I was a boy in the 1960s, I used to watch television like all of you, those of you who are older, as much as old as I am. And I'd watch shows like cartoons like Superman, although a Canadian invented it, or Mighty Mouse or Bugs Bunny, and I used to have a great affection for the United States. To me, it was simply a country that espoused the motto of peace, justice, and the American way, truth, justice, and the American way. Well, that no longer applies. And I don't think anybody in this room would argue that the United States is fundamentally different than what it was during the 1950s and 60s or even the 1970s. And because of that, I think I'd like to explain why this change took place. Because if I were to poll the audience, I bet I would find almost all of you, or most of you at least, would say the United States went downhill when George W. Bush occupied the White House. Until Bill Clinton was president, we had a pretty good time. September the 11th knocked down a couple of buildings, led to the passage of the USA Patriot Act. And from there, people might argue, we went into a spiral into the abyss of statism, torture, imperial overreach, and all other sorts of things you can associate with undemocratic activity. Well, if you do that, you end up with a problem. And the problem is this. On October 3rd, 2001, 24 days after September the 11th happened, the Department of Justice handed Congress a document. The Department of Justice handed Congress a document. It was called the USA Patriot Act. And Congress was told to pass it. Now, Congress is a legislative body. It's the body that makes laws. But here we have a Congress being told to follow a diktat from the executive, which is kind of weird. At least Congress should have the right of oversight. Congress should at least evaluate it, discuss it, debate it. Well, Senator Russell Feingold of Wisconsin, Democratic senator, was one such person who did read it and insisted on some amendments being made before he would introduce it for discussion. The Patriot Act was entered into the House October 23rd and signed by Bush on October 26th. Now, for legislation, that is an absurdly fast scenario. But that document did something very strange and very sad, because it legislated the Republic out of existence. That document killed the Republic and turned the United States into a proto-fascist empire, legally. But if we start from this perspective and think the United States went downhill from this date, we end up with a problem. We have to explain why a Congress would commit political suicide. Why would Congress do this? Well, if you have Congress comprised of Republicans and Democrats who are democratic, it doesn't make any sense. You don't just commit suicide like that. Well, my book takes a perspective that Congress was incapable of defending the Constitution, which of course the Patriot Act utterly destroys. It is my view that the United States went downhill not beginning with George W. Bush, but beginning with Ronald Reagan in 1980. And through a period of 25 years, the United States managed to mutate from a republic slowly toward a police state. And it did so because of events that came out of the Vietnam War. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back a bit to the climate of the 1960s and describe for you what happened because of the counterculture and the anti-war movement. In the 1960s, I'm sure many of you know, the United States was fighting two battles at once, Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society public spending programs. Johnson was a populist, he was a reformer. He believed in spending money to help Americans, the poor Americans, all Americans. The problem is it was an expensive proposition, and it ran counter to a lot of people's belief that the state ought to have no role in spending money on people, that people ought to be responsible for themselves. And a lot of conservatives, so-called Straussians or neoconservatives, took exception to this. And as a result of the anti-war movement, the Great Society spending, the rise of civil rights and sexual liberation and equality for women, there developed in the United States a reactionary anti-democratic countercurrent comprised of three distinct elements. One was evangelical Christians, who saw this as a dangerous threat to the stability of the United States and took exception to the spending programs and the liberalized sexual attitudes. The seminal point for this was the 1973 passage of the Roe versus Wade decision, which made abortion legal upon demand, or at least decriminalized it. In that same year, Paul Weyrich founded something called the Heritage Foundation, the very first so-called conservative think tank. And ultimately, 11 members of Heritage would find their way into Ronald Reagan's first government. So to all intents and purposes, Ronald Reagan was a front man for the Heritage Foundation. The second group were the so-called neocons, properly called Straussians, because they followed the teachings of a professor called Leo Strauss. And he got a big leg up from a man named Irving Kristol, a very influential I believe a Jewish professor who left New York, went to Washington, D.C., and helped turn Leo Strauss's philosophy of unenlightened self-interest into a major economic movement. Leo Strauss believed that a government had a right to lie to its own people, to keep truths from them, not to give people, the common people, any sort of help, because that would weaken the fiber of American society. And America had to be strong to face up to the threats of the communists and the fascists and all this sort of stuff. The third group were called Jewish Zionists. Norman Podhoretz, Irving Kristol, Charles Krauthammer, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, a whole list of individuals whom George H.W. Bush would collectively call the crazies.